I love white chocolate mocha. And when I went to Mecca a month and a half ago, I made sure I had my mocha every single day. But do you know that if I had drank a mocha in Mecca 500 years ago, I would have actually been jailed, taken in front of a judge, punished, and then whipped and lashed for the crime of drinking a mocha in Mecca. I kid you not. But before I get to the mocha in Mecca, do you know that even the word coffee, it actually comes from the Arabic, qahwa. You all know qahwa. And the English word coffee comes from the Arabic qahwa. And the Arabic qahwa, most likely it comes from a province or a land in Ethiopia called Kaffa. And it was in this area where people first roasted beans that we now call coffee beans or coffee plants. And some Yemeni traders, where are the Yemenis? Yemenis, represent, mashaAllah. Yes, indeed, Yemenis, mashaAllah. Wallahi, I would have been proud to be a Yemeni because our Prophet ﷺ praised the people of Yemen. Al-hikmatu yamanin wal-imanu yamaniya. Some Yemeni traders, they went to Ethiopia, and this is around the 9th Islamic century, the 13th or 12th Gregorian century, and they brought back these beans, and they called them beans from Kaffa, so qahwa, so coffee. And eventually they started growing these beans in Yemen. And it became so popular they had to export the beans to other lands. And the city of export was a very famous city, it's still a very famous export city, called Al-Mocha. And the beans from Al-Mocha and the preparation for Al-Mocha became mocha. And slowly but surely, coffee spread to other Arab lands and eventually made its way to Europe through Venice, especially Italy, and it started spreading throughout European lands. And therefore, coffee has always been associated with the Arabs, and in particular with the Yemenis in early pre-modernity, 17th, 18th, 19th century. And if you were to find any coffee bean canister or can that was sold here in America in the 19th and early 20th century, you would always find a picture of some weird dressed Arab, sometimes a scantily dressed Arab lady, you know, the veil and belly button open, you know, that type of stuff they have, you know, back in the 19th century. Coffee was associated with Arabs, and to this day, the most prized beans are called Arabica beans, because it was the Arabs, it was the Muslims who made coffee basically so popular. But it wasn't always popular. It was during the 1500s when qahwa spread to Ottoman lands, and the scholars there began even debating and drinking it. Eventually, it's made its way to Mecca and Medina. And it is mentioned in our books of history that on the 23rd of Rabi' al-Awwal, 917 Hijrah, corresponding to around March of 1511 CE, coffee had already spread to Mecca, and a scholar was doing tawaf around the Kaaba, and he saw a group of young men drinking something suspicious and having a good time in the corner of the haram. And he came up to them, and they immediately shut out the lantern and they hid whatever they were drinking. So he challenged them, what is this? And they finally confessed that they were drinking qahwa. So he had them arrested, and he brought them in front of a trial. A group of, I'm not making this up, some of you are looking at me as if, no, I'm not making this up, guys, this is exactly true, okay? And he brought them in front of a group of ulama, and he brought forth the Hanbalis, the Shafi'is, the Malikis, the Hanafis, because in those days, to get a new fatwa, they would bring all of the qudat of the various madhahib. And there was a debate in 917 AH. There was a debate that lasted for the better part of the day, some say even 2 days, where they went back and forth debating whether qahwa was halal or haram. And they brought forth witnesses, they brought forth expert testimony from doctors and from people who had confessed to drinking it. And it appears that eventually the ulama decided that qahwa was an intoxicant. Qahwa was a muskir. And therefore they gave a fatwa that it was haram to drink and sell qahwa, and that anybody who was caught drinking qahwa should be lashed and beaten because he's drinking a muskir. And in fact, some beatings were carried out. And eventually in 950 AH, corresponding to 1544 CE, the Uthmani Sultan, the Uthmani Khalifa, he actually ratified this decree and he made it the official state position that qahwa is a muskir, it is haram, and then the fatwas began to pour, literally pour, that saying that qahwa was an impermissible drink. And we have so many fatwa in that era. Now remember, we're talking about 900, 1000, 1100 hijrah. So you're not going to find Ibn Taymiyyah talking about qahwa. You're not going to find Ibn Hajar. You're not going to find this is like after 950 hijrah, which is around 1200, 1250 CE. And so we have Shaykh al-Azhar Ahmad ibn Abd al-Haq as-Sumbati. There's a fatwa he was asked that, Shaykh, what do you say about this new drink called qahwa that is known to change people's temperaments, and it is associated with much evil, and it is associated with backbiting and bad company, and it is typically accompanied by lazy men gambling away. That's what qahwa was associated with. Lazy men doing nothing except wasting their time gambling and wasting their days with dice and whatnot. So what is your position about? Now, by the way, even when you read the question, you already see where the sheikh's going to go with this, right? So the Shaykh gave a harsh fatwa saying that it is absolutely haram, and that all coffee houses, cafes, all coffee houses should be shut down, and that anybody who was discovered drinking qahwa or operating a coffee house should be jailed and lashed. And therefore, for the next few months, in Cairo, this is in Cairo, this is not in Mecca now, right? And this is, by the way, the pre-Najdi, Wahhabi, whatever takeover. This isn't this, we're talking about 1000 CE. This isn't some hardcore fanatic fundamentalist movement, somebody might say. No, these are the mainstream scholars. This was their position about qahwa. And so in Cairo, a number of people were jailed for drinking coffee and whipped and lashed for the punishment of a muskir. And at the time, the bulk of the Maliki and Shafi'i scholars agreed with this fatwa because they viewed qahwa as being a muskir. And in fact, a very famous scholar, Shaykh Shamsuddin al-Qattan, who is from Medina, he said qahwa and hashish are the same thing. Qahwa and hashish are the same. Another very famous scholar, Muhammad ibn Mahmud al-Zaini, who died in the 10th Islamic century, 16th Gregorian century, he wrote a treatise, an entire booklet against qahwa. And Shaykh al-Islam Abu Sa'ud al-Afandi, and Shaykh al-Islam Abu Sa'ud is a very famous author, most people of knowledge know him. He actually wrote a very famous treatise about qahwa, and other people also wrote books about it, Risala fi Ahkam al-Qahwa, there's a book there. Also, it is said that Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, it is alleged that the famous al-Suyuti wrote a book, Al-Istifta al-Safwa fi Tasfiyat al-Qahwa. And some scholars even said qahwa isn't just haram, qahwa is a bid'ah. Now, where they get this from? Well, the fact of the matter is that when the Yemeni traders first brought it in from Ethiopia, the first group of religious people to adopt qahwa were the Sufi tariqas. And they adopted the qahwa in order to give them the energy to do their dhikr sessions late into the night. So they began drinking qahwa as a part of their rituals in order that they do their dhikr and they do what they needed to do. So a number of scholars therefore said that because this group is doing this with this instrument, with this beverage, therefore it is becoming a bid'ah. Now please, I'm not saying that this was unanimous agreed. I'm just saying there was a trend. There were famous scholars. In fact, this was the official position. People were lashed and punished, but there were always dissenting opinions, obviously. There were others people who said it is not haram, but the official position in Mecca, in Ottoman lands, in Cairo, in the early part of the 9th, 10th century Islamic centuries, is that qahwa is a muskir. And this became the well-known position, so much so that Francis Bacon, one of the most famous intellectual thinkers of Europe of the 17th century, Francis Bacon, who's one of the founders of basically post-Renaissance thought, one of the most famous philosophers, anybody who's taken a class on Western philosophy knows Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon writes in 1626 that the Turks, meaning the Muslims, the Turks consider coffee as something that excites and disturbs the mind, i.e. a muskir. The Turks consider coffee as something that alters the mind. But the fatwas might have said one thing, society did something else. The fatwa might have said it's haram, but the people were drinking coffee. And they continued to drink qahwa, sometimes secretly and mostly in public. And the tide slowly but surely began to shift in the 11th Hijri, 17th Gregorian centuries, when more and more people began drinking qahwa. And there are a number of stories that are found, Allah knows how true they are, but there are a number of stories found in our literature of that time where a scholar who considered qahwa to be halal invited a group of scholars who considered coffee to be haram. He invited them over to discuss some issue. And he secretly gave them qahwa in the room. And he didn't tell them what it was, because obviously none of them had, tasted qahwa. So he gave them coffee that night. And mashallah, tabarakallah, the discussion that resulted about some fiqhi point was the most exciting discussion they had ever had. And one of them remarked, and the hours flew by and it was middle of the night, because obviously they're drinking coffee. And one of them remarks, "What was this drink you gave us? It really stimulated us to give this deep discussion." And so he told them, "This was the qahwa that you guys made haram." Now these stories are found in our tradition, but the fact of the matter is that there was a time when coffee was indeed considered to be haram by the majority, and especially those who are a little bit more conservative. And when I say conservative, I'm not using this as a slur, as a demeaning thing. I'm just saying there are certain scholars, they don't like change. There are certain scholars, they like status quo. That's what I mean by conservative. But slowly but surely, a small group of scholars began writing, being more vocal, saying, what's wrong with coffee? Coffee is not haram. Coffee is not a muskir. And a very famous Hanbali scholar by the name of Zainuddin Abdul Qadir al-Jaziri, who died 1587 CE, he wrote a book, Umdat al-Safwa fi Hill al-Qahwa. And this is the crux of the matter in declaring qahwa to be permissible. Umdat al-Safwa fi Hill al-Qahwa. And he wrote a very famous book, and there are manuscripts found of this book still to this day around the Muslim world. And slowly but surely, the group of scholars that considered coffee to be haram just dwindled away, and eventually this fatwa is basically unknown except in the books of history, so that when I tell it to you, you find it strange. But 500 years ago, this was the standard position. Coffee houses began to spread in Muslim lands, and these became places of socialization, sometimes good socializations, most of the time bad socialization, but there was also a lot of good there. And coffee houses became the place where the elite, the intellectual, the social class, the movers and shakers went to discuss issues. And it was in coffee houses that Al-Hasan al-Banna began his Ikhwan al-Muslimin movement back in the 1910s and 1920s. The first place Hasan al-Banna targeted was not the mosques, because he realized the people coming to the mosques don't need to be taught to come there. Rather, we need to target a different class of people. So Hasan al-Banna began giving his mawa'id, his khutab, his durus. He began the very first alim, because back then coffee houses were places where, generally speaking, not the religious people, you know what I'm saying? Yani those that are more into, music and smoke, they would smoke the shisha or the hookah over there. The people that are not associated with religion. Hasan al-Banna made it a point to go to those places. And he began preaching his message there. And that was what attracted a different crowd to come to the early Ikhwan al-Muslimin. And these days, of course, people don't even realize that there was a huge controversy over coffee. But the fact of the matter is, the sad fact of the matter, but we need to benefit and learn, is that coffee wasn't the only thing that was made haram in the course of our ummah. The fact of the matter is that a lot of things were considered to be bizarre, strange, haram, bid'ah, against the tradition. And later on they became standard.
فيا ذلي ويا خجلي إذا ما قال لي ربي أما استحييته تعصيني ولا تخشى من العتب وتخفي الذنب عن خلقي وتأبى في الهوى قربي فتب مما جنيت عسى تعود إلى رضا